Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Sometimes sharing these stories is the only way we remember we're not alone. I never imagined that death could arrive quietly. Not with sirens, not with shouting, not with the kind of drama you see on television. It came on an ordinary Tuesday morning while I was rinsing coffee mugs at the sink and my husband, Daniel, was tying his shoes by the door. He complained about his left arm feeling numb, said it was probably nothing, just slept wrong. I told him to sit down. He smiled at me the way he always did when he thought I worried too much, that small, crooked smile that used to make me feel safe. Then he collapsed. By the time the ambulance came, the house already felt hollow, like something essential had been scooped out of it. The doctor later said the words, "massive cardiac event," but all I heard was the echo of his shoes still sitting by the door, unlaced, waiting for feet that would never return. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of casseroles, whispered condolences, and paperwork that felt cruel in its normalcy. I signed forms, chose flowers, nodded while people told me Daniel had been a good man. 27 years of marriage reduced to checkboxes and signatures. I moved through it all like I was underwater, hearing voices but not quite understanding them. At night, I slept on my side of the bed, curled inward, leaving his side untouched, as if he might still come back and need the space. Grief does strange things to time. Minutes stretch, days collapse, you forget to eat, then suddenly it's dark again. The funeral was set for Saturday. A small chapel, cream-colored walls, wooden pews polished smooth by generations of sorrow. Daniel's mother sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her mouth set in a line that looked more like anger than grief. I noticed that, but at the time I thought everyone mourned differently. Our daughter, Lily, held my hand so tightly my fingers went numb. She's 24, old enough to understand death, but still young enough to look lost without her father. I kept my eyes on the casket, closed, simple, too small for the man I thought I knew. People filed in quietly, co-workers, neighbors, distant cousins. Familiar faces softened the edges of my pain. I remember thinking as the organ music began that maybe this was the worst of it. Maybe after today, the grief would settle into something manageable, something I could carry without collapsing. That was when I noticed them. They didn't come in together. That's what struck me first. 3 women, spaced apart, each choosing different pews, each with the same careful hesitation in their steps. The first was tall, elegant, dressed in black that looked expensive but understated. She had her hair pulled back tightly, like she was holding herself together by force. The second was younger, maybe mid-30s, with red-rimmed eyes and a tissue clenched in her hand like a lifeline. The third came in last, older than the other 2, her shoulders slightly stooped, her gaze fixed on the floor as if she didn't deserve to look up. None of them looked at me directly, but I felt their presence like a shift in the air. At first, I told myself they were coworkers or old friends. Daniel had worked in sales for years. He met all kinds of people. I tried to push the thought away, to focus on the pastor's words about love and legacy, but my chest felt tight, and not just from grief. There was a strange awareness, a sense of being watched from a distance. When the pastor invited people to share memories, my heart sank. I wanted the service to end. I wanted to go home and crawl back into bed and pretend this day never happened. A few people spoke. His brother talked about childhood fishing trips. A colleague mentioned Daniel's work ethic. Then, after a long pause, the tall woman stood up. The room seemed to hold its breath. She introduced herself by her first name only, her voice steady but trembling at the edges. She said Daniel had changed her life. She said he had shown her kindness when she needed it most. She said she would always carry him in her heart. She didn't say how she knew him, but the way she said his name, softly, intimately, sent a chill through me. I felt Lily's grip tighten. The second woman stood next. She cried openly, apologizing through sobs. She talked about laughter, about late-night conversations, about a man who made her feel seen. Each word felt like a small cut. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I heard someone clear their throat. The pastor looked confused, glancing at me as if asking permission with his eyes. I sat frozen, my mind racing, trying to assemble a puzzle with too many missing pieces. When the third woman arose, slowly, painfully, I could barely breathe. Her voice was quiet, almost apologetic. She said Daniel had been there for her during a hard chapter of her life. She said she owed him more than she could ever repay. Then she looked directly at me for the first time, her eyes filled with something that looked like shame, and said, "I'm sorry for your loss." The words landed differently from her mouth. They felt weighted, complicated, unfinished. By the time the service ended, I felt like I was standing in the ruins of a house I didn't remember building. People avoided my eyes as they passed, their condolences suddenly awkward, hurried. I caught snippets of whispers, questions murmured behind hands. Lily leaned in close and asked me, in a voice so small it barely existed, if I knew who those women were. I shook my head because I truly didn't. Or maybe I did, somewhere deep down, in a place I'd trained myself not to look. At the reception hall, the tall woman approached me. Up close, she smelled faintly of lavender. She told my name carefully, as if testing it. She told me again how sorry she was. I asked her how she knew my husband. The question felt foreign in my mouth, like a language I'd never spoken before. She hesitated, glanced around the room, and then said, "He mattered to me." It wasn't an answer, not really, but it was enough to confirm what my heart was already screaming. That night, after everyone left, after Lily went home with friends because she couldn't stand the quiet, I sat alone at the kitchen table. Daniel's phone was still there, face down, exactly where he'd left it. I stared at it for a long time before picking it up. My hands shook. Part of me wanted to smash it, to throw it against the wall and let the truth scatter in pieces. Another part of me needed to know, because whatever those women represented, whatever secrets they carried, they were now mine too. And I understood in that moment that grief wasn't just about losing someone. Sometimes it's about discovering you never truly had them at all. I didn't unlock Daniel's phone that night. I wish I could say it was because I respected his privacy, because I trusted him even in death. The truth is simpler and uglier. I was afraid that once I opened that door, there would be no closing it again. Afraid that the life I thought I'd lived for nearly 3 decades would collapse completely under the weight of whatever I found. So instead, I wrapped the phone in a dish towel like it could burn me and tucked it into the junk drawer, right next to old batteries and mismatched keys, pretending that secrets could be contained by wood and denial. Sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the 3 women standing one after the other, saying Daniel's name with familiarity I couldn't deny. I replayed moments from our marriage, searching for clues. Late nights he claimed were work dinners, weekend trips he took alone because I needed rest, the way he sometimes stared at his phone and smiled to himself before slipping it into his pocket when I entered the room. At the time, I chalked it up to stress, to aging, to the quiet distance that can grow even in long marriages. Now, every memory felt like evidence. The next morning, Lily came by. She looked exhausted, mascara smudged beneath her eyes, grief aging her overnight. She made coffee without asking, moving through the kitchen like muscle memory guided her. We sat across from each other at the table, the same table where Daniel used to read the paper every morning. She finally asked what she'd been holding back since the funeral. Who were those women? I opened my mouth to answer and realized I didn't have one. Saying, "I don't know," felt like another failure, another crack in the image of the family I'd promised her she had. After Lily left, I pulled the phone from the drawer. My heart pounded so loudly I thought I might pass out. Daniel had never changed his passcode. Our anniversary. I pressed the numbers with trembling fingers, and just like that, the phone unlocked. No dramatic resistance, no final barrier. The screen lit up, full of notifications I'd never seen. Messages, emails, missed calls. It felt like stepping into a room in my own house that I didn't know existed. I started with the messages. Names I didn't recognize filled the screen. Some conversations were brief, polite. Others were long, intimate, filled with emojis and inside jokes. I scrolled slowly, forcing myself to breathe. One name appeared over and over again. The tall woman, I realized, from the funeral. Her name was Marissa. Their messages went back years, not every day, but consistently, like a parallel life running quietly alongside mine. They talked about work at first, then about feelings, frustrations, longings. He told her he felt misunderstood at home. He told her he felt alive with her. Reading those words felt like swallowing glass. I put the phone down and walked to the bathroom, gripping the sink as nausea washed over me. I stared at my reflection, half expecting to see a stranger looking back. Was I really so blind? Or was I simply trusting? There's a difference, I told myself, though it didn't bring much comfort. After a few minutes, I went back and kept reading. I needed the whole truth, even if it destroyed what little stability I had left. The next woman's name was Elena, younger. Their messages were different, less polished, more emotional. He called her when she was upset. He reassured her, told her she deserved better than the life she'd been given. There were voice messages I couldn't bring myself to play. The timestamps showed late nights, early mornings, hours when he'd been lying next to me, breathing softly in his sleep. My chest ached with a pain that felt separate from grief, sharper, angrier. The third woman took longer to find. Her name was Ruth, the oldest of the three. Their messages were sparse but heavy. She spoke about fear, about starting over. He offered support, advice, money, yes, money, transfers I'd never noticed from our joint account, small enough not to raise alarms, but frequent enough to matter. I realized then that this wasn't just infidelity. This was a web of emotional entanglements, each one different, each one hidden in plain sight. By the time I finished reading, the sun was setting. I felt hollowed out, like something essential had been removed from me. I thought about confronting him, screaming, demanding answers. The absurdity of that thought made me laugh out loud, a broken, humorless sound that echoed through the empty house. Daniel was gone. There would be no explanations, no apologies, no chance for him to tell me what any of it meant. The mess was mine alone to clean up. That evening, my phone rang, an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer, but something told me I should. It was Marissa. She spoke carefully, like someone approaching a wounded animal. She said she hadn't meant to cause a scene at the funeral. She said she hadn't known about the others until she saw them there too. Hearing that made my stomach twist. Even his secrets had secrets. We met a few days later at a quiet cafe. I chose the place deliberately, neutral territory where neither of us held power. Seeing her across the table was surreal. She looked different without the black dress, softer somehow. She told me she'd met Daniel at a conference 10 years earlier. What started as friendship became something else, something she claimed she hadn't planned. She said he told me we were unhappy, that we were staying together for our daughter, a story as old as betrayal itself. I listened without interrupting, my hands folded tightly in my lap. When she finished, I asked her a simple question. Did she love him? She hesitated, then nodded. The honesty hurt more than a lie would have. She apologized again, tears in her eyes, but I realized something important in that moment. Her remorse didn't heal me. Her explanations didn't fix what was broken. Closure, I was learning, doesn't come from other people's words. It comes from facing your own truth. Over the following weeks, I spoke to Elena and Ruth too. Each conversation peeled back another layer of Daniel's life, another version of the man I'd married. To Elena, he was a rescuer. To Ruth, a lifeline. To me, he was a husband who paid the bills, attended school events, remembered anniversaries. All of it was real, all of it incomplete. Reconciling those truths felt impossible at first, like trying to hold water in my hands. Lily struggled the most. When I finally told her what I'd learned, she cried, not just for her father, but for the image she'd held of him. I reminded her, gently, that people are complex, that love and failure often exist in the same body. It was a lesson I was still trying to accept myself. Slowly, life began to move again. I started therapy. I took long walks. I learned to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. I realized that Daniel's choices, painful as they were, didn't erase the years we shared or the love that once existed. They simply added context, however ugly, to the story. One afternoon, while sorting through old photographs, I found a picture of us on our 10th anniversary. We looked genuinely happy. I held that image for a long time. It didn't lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. And maybe I thought that's how most lives are. Not neat narratives, but tangled ones full of contradictions we only see clearly in hindsight. I wasn't healed, not even close, but I was beginning to understand that my identity didn't have to be defined by my husband's secrets. I could grieve him and still hold him accountable in my heart. I could mourn the marriage I thought I had and still build a future that belonged solely to me. And that realization, fragile as it was, felt like the first honest breath I'd taken since the day he died.
The weeks after those conversations felt like walking through fog, not the soft kind that makes everything look romantic, but the heavy kind that dampens your clothes and seeps into your bones. People assumed that because the funeral was over, because thank you cards had been sent and casseroles returned, my grief must have settled into something quieter. They didn't see how each new morning brought a fresh reckoning. I was no longer just a widow. I was the keeper of a truth that rewrote my entire past. I started noticing things I'd overlooked before. The house itself seemed to change once I knew. The spare bedroom Daniel insisted on keeping empty, the locked drawer in his desk I'd never bothered to open, the way our calendar had gaps, weekends marked only with vague notes like travel or busy. Knowledge sharpens memory in cruel ways. I felt foolish for not questioning more, but therapy taught me something important. Trust, real trust, isn't stupidity. It's a choice made in good faith. The betrayal belonged to him, not to my willingness to believe. One afternoon, while sorting paperwork for the estate, I found a small envelope tucked inside an old tax folder. It was addressed to me in Daniel's handwriting, my name written carefully as if he'd practiced it. There was no date. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single page. He wrote that he loved me, that he was sorry for the ways he'd failed, that he hadn't known how to stop the life he'd built outside our marriage without destroying everyone involved. He said I deserved better than the truths he'd buried. Reading it, I felt a mix of anger and sadness so intense it made me dizzy. Apologies after death are complicated. They ask for forgiveness without offering repair. I showed the letter to my therapist. She didn't tell me how to feel. She asked me what I needed from it. That question lingered long after the session ended. Did I need to forgive him? Did I need to let go? Or did I need to allow myself to be angry without guilt? For years, I'd been the steady one, the forgiving one, the peacemaker. Maybe this was the moment I needed to be honest instead of kind. Lily came over often during that time. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we sat in silence, scrolling on our phones, sharing space without words. She admitted she was angry at her father, then immediately felt guilty for it. I told her anger doesn't cancel love, they can coexist. Watching her wrestle with that truth broke my heart and healed it at the same time. We were both learning how to hold complexity without dropping ourselves in the process. Not everyone was understanding. Daniel's mother, already distant, became colder. She hinted that I should have known, that men don't stray unless they're unhappy. The implication stung. I realized then how often women are asked to carry the weight of men's choices. I set a boundary with her, calmly but firmly. I told her I would not accept blame for something I did not do. It was the first time I'd ever stood up to her, and though it left me shaking, it also left me lighter. As months passed, practical matters demanded attention. The house felt too big, too full of echoes. I decided to sell it. Packing up 27 years of life was an exercise in both grief and clarity. Some things I kept, some I donated, some I threw away without a second thought. Letting go became a practice, a muscle I didn't know I needed to strengthen. Each box taped shut felt like a small declaration of independence. On the day I moved out, I stood in the empty living room one last time. I thanked the space for sheltering my family, for holding both joy and pain. It might sound strange, but rituals matter when you're rebuilding yourself. They give shape to loss. They mark transitions the heart needs acknowledged. I moved into a smaller apartment across town. It was bright, quiet, and entirely mine. For the first time in decades, every decision, every decoration, every routine belonged solely to me. That freedom was exhilarating and terrifying. Some nights I missed the comfort of another person breathing nearby, even knowing what I now knew. Loneliness doesn't always care about logic. One evening, months after the funeral, I ran into Ruth at the grocery store. She looked healthier, stronger. She told me she'd started a new job, that she was doing better. There was an awkward pause, then she thanked me. For what? I asked. For listening, she said, for not attacking her. I realized then that compassion, even when undeserved, had given me something too. It had freed me from carrying bitterness I didn't want in my future. I didn't keep in touch with Marissa or Elena. Their chapters in my life closed quietly, without drama. That surprised me. I expected lingering anger, unresolved tension. Instead, there was a calm finality. I had learned what I needed to know. Anything more would have kept me tethered to a past I was ready to release. A year passed. Anniversaries came and went. I marked Daniel's birthday by lighting a candle, not out of obligation, but acknowledgement. He had been many things, some good, some painful, all human. Accepting that allowed me to accept myself more fully too. I was no longer defining my life by the role of wife or widow. I was simply a woman moving forward with eyes open. The moral I carry now is a quiet one. Love doesn't guarantee honesty. Time doesn't guarantee intimacy. But self-respect, once reclaimed, can transform even the deepest betrayal into a turning point. I didn't choose the truth that arrived at my husband's funeral, but I chose what to do with it. And in that choice, I found a version of myself I hadn't met before. Stronger, clearer, whole, even with the cracks. After the first year passed, people began asking questions that made me uncomfortable. Not out of cruelty, but curiosity wrapped in concern. Was I dating? Was I lonely? Had I forgiven Daniel? I learned quickly that grief makes others uneasy, especially when it lingers beyond what they consider acceptable. They wanted a clean ending for my story, a bow. I didn't have one to offer. Healing, I discovered, isn't linear, and it doesn't perform well for an audience. What I did have was routine,
Morning walks, coffee at the same corner cafe where the barista knew my order, weekly therapy sessions that felt less like triage and more like gentle maintenance. I started journaling, something I'd abandoned years ago when life got busy. Writing without an audience allowed me to say the things I wouldn't say out loud. Rage, relief, confusion, unexpected gratitude. Putting it on paper made it manageable, as if naming the emotions shrank them to size. One afternoon, while unpacking a box I'd forgotten about, I found an old cassette tape labeled in Daniel's handwriting. My name again. The familiarity of his script stirred something in me, a mix of tenderness and dread. I almost threw it away. Curiosity won. I borrowed a player from a neighbor and sat on the floor, back against the couch, as the tape clicked and whirred to life. His voice filled the room, younger than I remembered. He talked about meeting me, about how grounded he made me feel. Then his tone shifted. He spoke about fear, about feeling split in too many directions. He admitted he'd made choices he didn't know how to undo. Listening to him confess without interruption was surreal. There was no opportunity to argue, to ask questions, to demand accountability. Just his truth, incomplete and self-serving in places, sincere in others. When the tape ended, I sat in silence for a long time. Then I removed it from the player and snapped it in half. Some things don't need to be preserved. Lily visited later that week. She noticed the broken tape in the trash and asked about it. I told her the truth. She listened quietly, then said something that surprised me. She said she was glad I'd heard it, even if I didn't keep it, that it meant her father had at least tried, in his own flawed way, to explain himself. Children don't need perfect parents, I realized. They need honesty, even if it comes late. As my life settled into its new shape, I began to notice how much of myself I'd set aside during my marriage, not out of sacrifice exactly, but habit. I'd deferred, compromised, chosen stability over curiosity. Now, with no one to check in with, I enrolled in a pottery class. My first attempts were clumsy, lopsided, more humorous than artistic, but there was something grounding about working with my hands, about creating something imperfect and tangible. The instructor told us that clay remembers pressure, that even when you smooth the surface, the material holds the history of every touch. That stayed with me. People, I thought, aren't so different. I also reconnected with friends I'd drifted from over the years, women who welcomed me back without questions or judgment. We shared dinners, laughter, long conversations that stretched late into the night. I told parts of my story when I felt ready. Each time it felt less heavy, less like a confession and more like context. I was no longer ashamed of what had happened to me. Shame thrives in silence. I was done feeding it. Dating crossed my mind occasionally, but I didn't rush it. I wasn't afraid of men. I was afraid of disappearing again, of losing myself in someone else's needs, someone else's narrative. So I waited, and in that waiting, I learned to enjoy my own company, to trust my instincts, to recognize red flags I'd once painted over with optimism. One day, while cleaning out an old email account, I found a draft message I'd written years earlier and never sent. It was addressed to Daniel. In it, I'd asked him why he seemed distant, whether he was happy, whether we were okay. I read it with a strange sense of detachment. I'd sensed something back then. I'd reached out. The response, or lack of one, hadn't been my failure. I deleted the draft and closed the account. That chapter was done. On the second anniversary of his death, I visited Daniel's grave alone. I brought no flowers, just myself. I spoke aloud, not to accuse or forgive, but to acknowledge. I told him I hoped he'd found peace. I told him I was learning to live honestly. When I walked away, I didn't look back. That felt important. The story people expected from me was one of devastation followed by redemption through forgiveness or new love. The truth was quieter.
I had rebuilt my life piece by piece, not around what I'd lost, but around what I refused to lose again: my integrity, my voice, my sense of self. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's not that secrets always surface or that betrayal is inevitable. It's that we're stronger than the lies that try to define us. I didn't choose to meet 3 women at my husband's funeral, but I chose to meet myself afterwards, and that meeting changed everything. Life has a way of testing new strength just when you begin to trust it. I learned that lesson the hard way, about 6 months after I started to feel steady again. It came in the form of a letter from a lawyer I didn't recognize, addressed to me in formal, impersonal language. My name typed cleanly at the top, like it belonged to someone else. Inside was a notice regarding Daniel's estate. Apparently, there were assets I hadn't known about, accounts held separately, beneficiaries listed that weren't me. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, the letter untouched beside my coffee. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let sleeping truths lie. But I'd learned by then that avoidance only delays pain. It never prevents it. I called the number listed and scheduled a meeting. The lawyer was polite, efficient, and clearly uncomfortable. He explained that Daniel had maintained a small investment account in his name only. Not illegal, just undisclosed. 3 names appeared as partial beneficiaries: Marissa, Elena, Ruth. Hearing them again felt like reopening a wound I thought had scarred over. The amounts weren't large, but the implication was heavy. Daniel had planned for them, had considered a future where I wouldn't be the only one affected by his absence. I asked the lawyer what my options were. He said I could contest it, argue undue influence, claim lack of disclosure. The process would be long, expensive, and emotionally draining. I thought about it carefully, not because I wanted revenge, but because I needed to decide what justice looked like for me. In the end, I chose not to fight it. The money meant little compared to the peace I'd built. Letting go, again, felt like the right choice. When the women were notified, each reached out in their own way. Elena sent a long message, apologetic, conflicted. Ruth sent a brief note thanking me. Marissa didn't contact me at all. I didn't need explanations. I was done collecting them. I replied politely where I felt it was necessary, and then closed that door for good. Around that time, Lily announced she'd been accepted into graduate school in another state. Pride and sadness collided in my chest. Watching your child step fully into their own life is bittersweet under the best circumstances. We packed her apartment together, laughed over mismatched furniture, cried in the quiet moments between. On the day she left, I hugged her longer than usual. She whispered that she was proud of me. That meant more than she could ever know. With Lily gone, the apartment felt different, quieter, but not empty. I filled the space intentionally. Music in the mornings, candles at night. I hosted friends for dinner without worrying about anyone else's preferences. I cooked what I liked. I lived how I wanted. Independence stopped feeling like a temporary state and started feeling like home. It was during one of my pottery classes that I met Thomas. He wasn't dramatic or mysterious. He was gentle, observant, content to let silence exist. We talked about art, about travel, about loss. He never pushed. When I eventually told him my story, or at least the version I was ready to share, he listened without trying to fix it. That, I realized, was everything. We moved slowly. Pain teaches patience if you let it. There were moments when old fears surfaced, when I questioned my instincts, but I didn't ignore them. I talked about them, and each time I did, they loosened their grip. Trust, I learned, isn't about certainty. It's about transparency. With him, I didn't feel the need to shrink or perform. I felt present. One evening, while cleaning out the last remaining box from my old house, I found my wedding album. I considered throwing it away. Instead, I sat on the floor and turned each page carefully. There was joy there, real joy. It didn't vanish because the ending was flawed. I closed the album and placed it back in the box, not as a shrine, but as a record, a chapter of my life, not the whole book. The final closure came unexpectedly. A year later, I received a handwritten note from Daniel's mother. She apologized, not fully, not perfectly, but sincerely enough. She admitted she'd been angry at him and taken it on me. I forgave her, not because she deserved it, but because I didn't want to carry that weight anymore. Looking back now, I see that my husband's death didn't just reveal secrets, it revealed me, my capacity to endure, to choose grace without surrendering dignity, to rebuild without erasing the past. The 3 women who came to his funeral were messengers of truth, however painful. They forced me to confront reality, and in doing so, gave me the chance to reclaim my life. This story doesn't end with perfect healing or tidy forgiveness. It ends with honesty, with a woman who learned that her worth was never tied to a man's fidelity, that love, while powerful, is not the only foundation for a meaningful life, and that sometimes the most profound rebirth comes from standing in the ashes of what you thought you knew and choosing to live anyway. By the time the 3rd year arrived, I no longer measured my life in before and after. The sharp line that once divided everything had softened into something more fluid, more human. I still thought about Daniel, but not with the same ache. His memory had shifted from a wound to a scar, present, visible, but no longer bleeding. I had stopped bracing myself every morning, stopped expecting grief to ambush me in the middle of an ordinary day. Instead, it showed up occasionally, quietly, like an old acquaintance passing through town. Thomas remained a gentle presence in my life. We never rushed to define what we were. Labels felt unnecessary, even intrusive. We shared weekends, meals, long walks where conversation drifted and settled naturally. He never tried to step into Daniel's shadow or replace anything I'd lost. He simply stood beside me, solid and patient. Loving again didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like expansion, like discovering a room in myself I hadn't known existed. Still, healing has a way of circling back to test you. One afternoon, I received a message from a woman I didn't recognize. Her name didn't match any I already knew. My stomach tightened as I read her words. She said she'd recently learned about Daniel's death and felt compelled to reach out. She said she'd known him briefly years ago and that she was sorry if her message caused pain. I stared at the screen for a long time, surprised by my own calm. Instead of spiraling, I felt clarity. I thanked her for her honesty and told her I wished her well. That was it. No questions, no unraveling. I didn't need to know every version of the man I'd married to know myself. That moment marked something important. I was no longer defined by revelation. The truth no longer had the power to destabilize me. It simply existed, and I existed beyond it. Lily came home that summer, older somehow, more sure of herself. We spent evenings on the balcony, talking about her studies, her friendships, the life she was building. She asked thoughtful questions about mine, about Thomas, about how I'd changed. I told her the truth, that I'd learned to listen to myself, that I no longer ignored discomfort just to keep the peace, that I finally understood love should not require self-erasure. Watching her absorb those lessons, not as warnings but as wisdom, felt like breaking a cycle.
There was one final task I'd been avoiding, Daniel's old storage unit. I'd kept paying for it out of habit, out of reluctance to confront whatever waited inside. One Saturday morning, I drove there alone. The unit smelled of dust and cardboard. Inside were boxes of old work files, clothes he'd stopped wearing, souvenirs from trips I hadn't known about. I sorted through them slowly. Most of it was meaningless now, objects stripped of context. At the back, I found a small wooden box. Inside were letters, not to me, to each of the women, some apologetic, some romantic, some vague enough to mean different things to different people. Reading them didn't hurt the way it once would have. Instead, it clarified something I'd struggled to articulate. Daniel hadn't been trying to hurt anyone. He'd been trying to avoid discomfort, to be everything to everyone without ever being fully honest. That avoidance caused harm anyway. Intent doesn't erase impact, but understanding that distinction helped me release the last of my anger. I left the unit with one box. Inside it, I placed the few items I wanted to keep. A watch he'd worn for years, a photo of us laughing on a beach. Not because I needed reminders, but because I wanted to honor the parts that were real without denying the rest. The remaining contents I donated or discarded. When I locked the unit for the final time, I felt something close to relief. As I drove home, I realized I hadn't cried. That surprised me. Not because crying is weakness, but because it marked how far I'd come. Grief no longer demanded tears to be acknowledged. It simply existed as part of my story, not the headline. People still occasionally asked about my past, about my husband. I answered honestly, but briefly. I no longer felt the need to explain or justify. My life wasn't a cautionary tale or a tragedy. It was a testament to resilience, to the quiet power of choosing yourself when the ground falls away. Sometimes I think about that day in the chapel, the three women standing, one after another, the shock, the humiliation, the unraveling. If I could speak to the woman I was then, I would tell her this: you will survive this, not by becoming harder, but by becoming truer. You will learn that betrayal can coexist with love, that endings can birth beginnings, and that your worth was never dependent on how faithfully someone else loved you. This is the truth I carry now. We don't always get the lives we planned. Sometimes we get the lives that wake us up. And if we're brave enough to face what's revealed, those lives can still be deeply, profoundly ours.
There is a quiet moment that comes after survival, one no one really talks about. It's the moment when you realize you're no longer reacting, you're choosing. For a long time, my life had been shaped by responses to loss, to truth, to aftermath. But somewhere along the way, without ceremony or announcement, I stepped into intention. I woke up each morning not wondering how to endure the day, but how I wanted to live it. That shift showed up in small ways first. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. I stopped explaining my choices unless I genuinely wanted to. When people asked about my husband now, I didn't brace myself. I told the truth in measured pieces, not to protect anyone else, but to protect my own peace. I learned that privacy is not secrecy, it's self-respect. Thomas noticed the change before I did. One evening, as we sat on the couch listening to music, he said I seemed lighter, more grounded. I laughed softly and told him it felt like I'd finally come home to myself. He didn't respond with words. He just took my hand, and for once, I didn't tense. I let the moment be what it was: safe, present, enough. Not everyone welcomed this version of me. A few acquaintances drifted away, uncomfortable with my boundaries, with my refusal to perform grief or forgiveness on demand. I let them go without resentment. People who only know how to relate to you when you're broken rarely know what to do when you're whole. That realization hurt less than I expected. It felt like another layer shedding naturally.
I began volunteering at a local support group for widows and widowers. I didn't share my full story at first. I listened. I watched others navigate fresh pain, disbelief, anger. I recognized myself in their expressions, in their questions. When I did speak, I didn't offer platitudes. I offered honesty, that it would hurt, that it would change them, and that they would still find joy again, though it might look different than they imagined. Helping others didn't reopen my wounds. It reminded me how far I'd come. One afternoon, a woman stayed behind after the meeting. She was younger, her grief raw and frantic. She asked me how I knew when I was ready to move forward. I thought about it carefully before answering. I told her readiness isn't a feeling, it's a decision, a quiet one you make when staying stuck hurts more than stepping into the unknown. She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and hugged me. In that embrace, I felt something close to purpose. Lily visited again in the fall. She brought a friend with her, someone she was serious about. Watching her laugh, watching the ease with which she loved, filled me with pride and humility. She had not inherited my wounds. She had learned from them. That felt like the greatest gift I could have given her. Later that night, as we cleaned up dinner, she asked me if I regretted staying with her father as long as I did. The question caught me off guard. I thought about the years, the good mornings, the shared jokes, the family we built. Then I thought about the cost of ignorance, of trust misplaced. I told her the truth. I didn't regret the love. I regretted the silence, the moments I sensed something was wrong and chose comfort over confrontation. She listened intently, absorbing the nuance. We hugged, and I felt the cycle bend, not repeat. As winter approached, Thomas and I had a conversation I'd once feared, about commitment, about what the future might hold. I told him I wasn't afraid of loving deeply again, but I would never ignore my intuition for the sake of stability. He told me he didn't want a relationship built on fear or avoidance. We agreed on something simple and profound. Honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, would be our foundation. That agreement mattered more to me than any promise of forever. On the anniversary of the funeral, I did something unexpected. I returned to the chapel alone. It was empty, quiet. I sat in the same pew where I'd watched my life fracture. I closed my eyes and breathed. I remembered the shock, the confusion, the sense of humiliation. Then I opened my eyes and looked around with new awareness. That place no longer held power over me. It was just a room. The meaning had changed because I had changed. I didn't cry. I smiled faintly, not because I was glad for what happened, but because I had survived it without losing myself. I stood, walked out, and let the door close softly behind me. That sound felt final in the best possible way. The moral of my story isn't dramatic. It doesn't end with revenge or public reckoning. It ends with self-trust, with a woman who learned the truth, no matter how painful, is always preferable to illusion, that love should never require blindness, and that when life reveals itself in brutal ways, we are still allowed to choose what kind of person we become afterward. I was once defined by the shock of 3 women standing at my husband's funeral. Now I am defined by what I did next. I chose honesty. I chose growth. I chose myself, and that choice changed everything. Time has a way of revealing what truly lasts. Not the sharp moments of crisis, but the quiet habits you return to once the noise fades. By the time the 4th year rolled around, my life had settled into something steady and recognizable. Not the life I once imagined, but one that fit me better now. I woke without dread. I made plans without second-guessing myself. I trusted my internal voice in a way I never had before, and that trust became my compass. Thomas and I continued to grow together, slowly and deliberately. We didn't merge lives out of fear of being alone. We chose companionship because it added something real. There were disagreements, of course, misunderstandings, moments where old reflexes tried to resurface. The difference was that we talked about them immediately, honestly. There was no hiding behind politeness or silence, no pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. Each conversation, even the uncomfortable ones, reinforced the truth that safety isn't the absence of conflict, it's the presence of respect. I kept volunteering with the support group, and eventually I began facilitating sessions myself, not as an expert, but as someone who had walked through the fire and come out changed rather than destroyed. I noticed a pattern in the stories people shared. So many of them weren't just grieving loss, they were grieving illusions. The marriage they thought they had, the future they assumed was guaranteed. I understood that grief intimately. It had once felt like the ground had been pulled from beneath me. Now it felt like solid ground, rebuilt from honest materials. One evening after a meeting, a man approached me. He was older, his grief quieter, folded inward. He said something that stayed with me. He said that losing his wife had shown him who he really was when no one was watching. I nodded, because that was true for me too. Trauma strips away performance. What remains is who you are willing to be when comfort is gone. Lily visited less frequently as her life expanded, but when she did, our time felt richer. We talked as equals now, not just mother and daughter, but two women navigating adulthood with open eyes. She told me she'd ended a relationship because something felt off, even though she couldn't fully explain why. She said she remembered what I taught her, to listen early. I hugged her, pride swelling in my chest. If my pain had given her clarity, then it had not been wasted. Every so often, memories of Daniel surfaced unexpectedly. A song on the radio, a phrase someone used that sounded like him. Instead of pushing those moments away, I let them pass through me. Memory doesn't require loyalty, it requires acknowledgement. I no longer needed to defend him or condemn him. He existed as he was, complex, flawed, human. Accepting that allowed me to remain soft without becoming naive. I received one final message about him that year. It came from a former colleague who had found an old photograph while cleaning out a shared office space. It was of Daniel at a company retreat, smiling at the camera, relaxed. The colleague asked if I wanted it. I surprised myself by saying yes. When it arrived, I placed it in a drawer, not on display, not hidden either, just where it belonged, part of the archive of my life. One quiet Sunday morning, as sunlight spilled across my kitchen floor, I realized something that stopped me mid-step. I was happy. Not ecstatic, not euphoric, just content in a way that didn't demand anything else. That kind of happiness doesn't announce itself. It settles in. It feels like breathing without effort. I thought back to the woman I had been at the funeral, frozen, humiliated, certain her life had ended in that chapel. If I could reach back through time, I wouldn't tell her it would all make sense someday. That would have felt dismissive. I would tell her something simpler. This pain will not be the end of you. It will be the place you learn how deeply you can stand. The moral of my story crystallized there. Truth is not cruel. It is clarifying. What hurts is the delay, the denial, the years spent bending yourself around someone else's silence. When the truth finally arrives, even in the most brutal way, it offers an invitation to live honestly, to love without self-betrayal, to choose clarity over comfort. I didn't win anything when my husband died. There was no victory in discovering his secrets, but I gained something more enduring: agency. The ability to define my life on my own terms, to decide what I would tolerate, what I would cherish, and what I would leave behind without regret. The 3 women who came to his funeral changed my life without ever meaning to. They cracked open a story that had been quietly suffocating me. And through that rupture, I found my way back to myself. Not the woman I was before, a stronger, wiser version shaped by truth. This is where my story rests now. Not in bitterness, not in denial, but in acceptance. The kind that allows you to move forward without dragging the past behind you like an anchor. I am not defined by who my husband loved in secret. I am defined by how I chose to live once the secrets were revealed. And that choice continues to carry me, one honest day at a time.
As the years continued to unfold, I noticed that my relationship with the past had fundamentally changed. It no longer felt like something chasing me, demanding attention, demanding explanation. It felt more like a photograph tucked into a book I had already read and returned to the shelf. Important, formative, but no longer disruptive. I carried it with awareness, not weight. One spring morning, I was invited to speak at a small community event about resilience. I almost declined. Publicly attaching meaning to private pain still felt vulnerable. But something in me knew it was time, not to expose my story in full detail, but to speak from the place beyond it. I stood in front of a modest crowd and talked about truth, about how it often arrives without kindness, without warning, about how survival isn't heroic or dramatic most days. It's quiet. It's choosing to get up and live honestly even when the version of life you imagined has collapsed. Afterward, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She said she'd discovered something devastating about her marriage just weeks earlier. She asked me how I stopped replaying the moment everything shattered. I told her the truth. I didn't stop, not right away. I let the moment exist until it lost its power. Pain doesn't shrink when you fight it. It shrinks when you face it without running. She nodded slowly, like someone memorizing a map they'd need soon. That conversation stayed with me. It reminded me why stories like mine matter. Not because they shock or entertain, but because they offer companionship in moments when people feel most alone. Betrayal isolates. Grief isolates. Truth, when shared carefully, reconnects. Thomas and I eventually decided to live together, not as a milestone to check off, but as a natural extension of what we'd built. The transition was gentle. No upheaval, no anxiety. I kept my independence, my routines, my voice. He respected that without question. Love, I learned, doesn't demand surrender. It invites presence. One evening, while unpacking a shared bookshelf, I came across a journal from my first year after Daniel's death. I hadn't opened it in a long time. I sat on the floor and read a few pages. The woman who wrote those words was raw, disoriented, desperate for certainty. I felt tenderness toward her, not embarrassment, not distance, gratitude. She had survived the hardest chapter so I could stand here now. I closed the journal and placed it back on the shelf. Some parts of you don't disappear, they evolve. There was one lingering question I'd never fully answered for myself. Did I ever truly know my husband? The answer, I realized, was both yes and no. I knew the version of him he allowed me to see, the version shaped by routine, family, shared history. I didn't know the parts he hid, the parts driven by fear and avoidance. Both were real. Accepting that paradox freed me from the need for a single, tidy conclusion. On the 5th anniversary of his death, I did something different. I didn't mark the day with reflection or ritual. I spent it living. I met a friend for lunch. I walked through a park. I laughed. Later that night, I noticed the date on the calendar and felt a quiet acknowledgement pass me. That was enough. Grief doesn't need constant rehearsal to be honored. Lily called me that evening, unaware of the significance of the day. She talked about her plans, her ambitions, her happiness. As I listened, I understood something deeply. Life hadn't paused when my world cracked open. It had continued, offering new chapters whether I felt ready or not. Choosing to participate again had been the bravest thing I'd done. If there is a final truth I've come to accept, it's this. We don't get closure from answers. We get it from alignment, from living in a way that matches what we now know to be true. My husband's secrets altered my understanding of the past, but they did not get to dictate my future. I chose clarity. I chose self-respect. I chose a life that no longer required me to ignore my instincts to keep the peace. The day 3 women came to my husband's funeral will always exist as a turning point, but it is no longer the defining moment of my story. It was the opening, not the ending. What followed was harder, quieter, and infinitely more meaningful. A woman rebuilding herself without bitterness. A life reshaped by truth rather than illusion. A future claimed, not inherited. This is where I stand now. Not untouched by loss, but no longer ruled by it. I am living proof that even the most devastating revelations can become the foundation for a stronger, more honest life. And if you're listening to this while standing in your own moment of shock, know this: you are not broken beyond repair. You are standing at the beginning of a truth that one day will set you free in ways you can't yet imagine.
There's a stillness that comes when a story is nearly finished, even if life itself keeps moving. I felt it as I entered what I think of now as my season of quiet confidence. Not loud, not performative, just steady. The kind of confidence that doesn't need validation because it's rooted in self-knowledge. I had earned that steadiness through years of reckoning, and I guarded it gently. By then, most people in my life knew my history in broad strokes. Fewer knew the details, and even fewer needed to. I no longer felt obligated to educate everyone about my pain. Some lessons are meant to be shared, others are meant to be lived. I chose discernment over disclosure, and that choice brought peace. Thomas and I created rituals that belonged only to us. Sunday breakfasts, evening walks, quiet check-ins where we asked each other not how the day went, but how we felt inside it. Those conversations mattered more than any grand gesture. They kept us aligned. They kept us honest. I never again wanted a life where emotional distance was normalized as maturity. Occasionally, someone would ask if I ever wished I'd known the truth sooner. It's a natural question, heavy with hindsight. The answer surprised even me. Yes, I wished I'd known, but I no longer wished I'd lived differently with the information I had at the time. I had loved sincerely. I had shown up fully. That mattered. Regret had no real place to land. I began mentoring a younger woman at work who reminded me of my former self, capable, kind, over-accommodating. She confided in me one afternoon that she felt something was off in her relationship but couldn't justify her discomfort. I told her something I wish someone had told me years ago. You don't need proof to honor your intuition. Discomfort is information. She looked relieved, as if permission had been granted. In that moment, my past pain transformed into something useful. One evening, while reorganizing files, I came across Daniel's death certificate. I hadn't looked at it in years. The finality of it no longer jolted me. It simply existed as a fact. I placed it back in the folder and closed the drawer. There was no ceremony, no emotional surge. That, too, felt like progress. I realized then that forgiveness, for me, had never been a dramatic decision. It had been a gradual release. Not absolution, not forgetting, just choosing not to let resentment occupy space it no longer deserved. Forgiveness didn't mean what happened was acceptable. It meant I was done letting it dictate my emotional weather. Lily called one night to tell me she was engaged. I cried, laughed, asked 100 questions. After we hung up, I sat quietly, overwhelmed with gratitude. She was building a life informed by truth, not fear. Whatever pain she might face in the future, she would face it with eyes open. That was enough for me. As I prepared to attend her wedding months later, I stood in front of the mirror and studied my reflection. I saw lines I didn't have before, strength in places that once held softness alone. I didn't look like the woman I used to be. I looked like someone who had lived fully, honestly, and survived. On the morning of the ceremony, I felt a fleeting thought pass me through. Daniel should have been here. Then another followed it, just as gently. But he wasn't, and life had still unfolded. Love had still grown. The world had not ended when my illusion did. It had widened. At the reception, as I watched Lily dance, I felt a deep, unshakable peace. This was the legacy that mattered. Not the secrets, not the betrayals, but the resilience that followed, the clarity passed down quietly through example rather than instruction. I've learned that endings don't announce themselves. They arrive softly, disguised as ordinary days. The end of my story with Daniel didn't come at his funeral. It came years later when his memory no longer defined my present, when my life stood on its own, complete and self-directed. If there is one final lesson I hold close, it's this. You don't move on by erasing what happened. You move forward by integrating it without letting it dominate you. Truth may break you open, but it also creates space. Space for honesty, space for self-respect, space for a life that finally fits. I began this journey shattered by the shock of 3 women standing at my husband's funeral. I end it grounded, clear-eyed, and whole, not because the past changed, but because I did, and that has made all the difference. There's something profoundly different about living a life that no longer needs explanation. I didn't realize how much energy I had spent for years shaping my experiences into something palatable for others, making sense of them, softening edges, searching for meaning that could be neatly summarized. By the time I reached this final chapter, I understood that my life didn't need to resolve into a lesson anyone else approved of. It only needed to be honest. Lily's wedding came and went like a beautiful, luminous dream. Standing beside her, adjusting her veil, I felt a quiet awe at how life continues to unfold even after the ground beneath you collapses. She looked radiant, unburdened, hopeful. Watching her exchange vows rooted in openness and mutual respect felt like a full circle moment I hadn't known to anticipate. Whatever I had endured, whatever truths had shattered my earlier assumptions, had not poisoned her future. If anything, they had strengthened it. After the wedding, when the house grew quiet again, I noticed something subtle. I wasn't sad, not in the way I might have expected. There was no echo of absence, no sense of being left behind. I felt complete. My life no longer revolved around who was missing. It revolved around who I was. Thomas and I continued forward with intention. We talked about the future, not in sweeping promises, but in shared values. Where we wanted to live, how we wanted to age, what kind of peace we refused to sacrifice. We understood that love doesn't protect you from loss. Nothing does. But honesty gives you a foundation strong enough to withstand it. One quiet afternoon, I found myself driving past the old neighborhood where Daniel and I once lived. I hadn't planned it. My hand simply turned the wheel without instruction. I parked across the street from the house, now painted a different color, occupied by strangers. Children's laughter floated through an open window. Life, uninterrupted. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel grief. I felt gratitude. That chapter had held both joy and pain, and it had shaped me, but it no longer owned me. I thought about the woman I had been before the funeral, the one who believed stability was the same thing as truth, the one who ignored the quiet signals because confronting them felt like risking everything. I don't judge her now. She did the best she could with the understanding she had. Compassion for your former self is one of the hardest forms of healing and one of the most necessary. If I'm honest, the three women who came to my husband's funeral gave me something I never would have chosen but desperately needed. They shattered a story that was slowly erasing me. They forced truth into the light, not gently, not kindly, but decisively. And once it was there, I could finally see myself clearly. I learned that betrayal doesn't just break trust in others, it fractures trust in yourself. Rebuilding that inner trust took time. It required listening instead of dismissing, choosing discomfort over denial, letting go of the need to be agreeable at the cost of authenticity. But once rebuilt, that trust became unshakable. Today, my life is not dramatic. It is not fueled by anger or defined by loss. It is full of ordinary moments made rich by awareness. Morning light through the window, conversations that don't require guessing, love that doesn't ask me to disappear, peace that doesn't depend on pretending. If you're listening to this and standing at the edge of your own revelation, I want you to hear this clearly. The shock may feel unbearable. The truth may feel like it has stolen everything you thought was solid. But there is a version of you waiting on the other side of that truth who is wiser, stronger, and more alive than you can imagine right now. I did not get to choose how my marriage ended. I did not get to choose the moment my illusions were stripped away in public, painful clarity. But I chose what came after. I chose to face reality without losing my humanity. I chose to rebuild without bitterness. I chose to live honestly, even when honesty was inconvenient. And that choice changed everything. My husband's death was not the end of my story. The three women at his funeral were not my undoing. They were the beginning of my awakening, the moment I stopped living inside a version of life shaped by silence and started living one grounded in truth. This is where I leave my story, not in sorrow, not in resentment, but in quiet strength, with a life that belongs fully to me, with love that is clear-eyed and mutual, with a future that no longer depends on what is hidden. If there is a moral here, it is simple and hard-earned. The truth will always find its way to the surface. When it does, you can let it destroy you or you can let it free you. I chose freedom, and I have never regretted it.